Welcome, everyone, and welcome to Gene Ferraro, who's here to read from his compelling novel, Ordinary Evil. We've known Gene here at the bookstore for many years, and we're happy to celebrate the arrival of his new book. This is a real page-turner. Gene has written from many points of view as he introduces his cast of characters. He weaves together a community within a town and within the church, a hierarchy of the Catholic Church reaching up to the Vatican. As you read, you get swept along as he introduces each person, and then you begin to discern a pattern as the cast begins to converge. The writing is remarkable for a first novel, the complexity of the plot, and also the force of his language. In this story, Gene confronts a number of difficult problems and some horrific events with unflinching honesty. I have read for years about how the church betrayed the trust of so many and believed in their priests and depended upon the church to protect and comfort them. Though most priests are honorable, we have read with disbelief about the whole sexual abuse scandal and the cover-up by the church. As you read, this book really brings the whole tragedy home in a very dramatic and personal way. One review that I read points out how Gene illuminates the devastating effects of the silence of individuals, the failure of institutions, and the abuse of power. As a Catholic, Gene believes in the majesty of the Church and the truth of its teachings, so he gives us an insider's view and an understanding of the Church that many of us do not have. Some of the passages in this book are very difficult to read and hard to believe. However, it is important, I think, not to turn away. So much in the past has been overlooked and hidden away. It is hard to believe that this is Gene's first book. However, he writes and produces presentations and events for businesses and organizations. He's also worked in documentary film and taught motion picture production. He's a graduate of Bowdoin College and has an MFA from Columbia University, and also served as an officer in the U.S. Army Signal Corps. I want to end with another review of Ordinary Evil. This one says, Gene Ferraro takes you on a trip that has more turns than the Indy 500. He keeps you guessing, and the ending is worth the wait. Join me in welcoming Gene Ferraro.
I'd like to thank everybody for coming here tonight and for giving me the opportunity to do this. Before I get started, I'd like to say that it's really important that all of us patronize this store and the other independent bookstores like it. We're really fortunate to have in this store the oldest general interest bookstore in the United States, right here. And in many ways, these bookstores and even books themselves are an endangered resource. So I hope all of you will buy books here that you want to read so that this store will continue to thrive and continue to be part of our community. Now, I brought St. Rita along with me. I picked her up in Old San Juan, Puerto Rico in 2004 in a shop called El Galpon. And she's sat on my desk ever since, and she used to hold a cross in her hand, but I lost it. Now she holds a sharpened stick. Either way, she's quite a formidable woman, and she kept me company through this whole writing adventure. And it certainly is an adventure, and it continues to be one. St. Rita, like St. Jude's, the patron saint of impossible causes, and she's also the patron saint of damaged wives and children, and a consoler of the powerless. She's got a bloody gash on her forehead, which is supposedly a symbol of her kinship with Christ's crown of thorns. And St. Rita's the name of one of the parishes that's almost like a recurring character throughout the book. So she's going to probably help me out, and she really has helped me out. If you looked at the New Catholic Dictionary, the definition of ordinary is something like this. Ordinary. In ecclesiastical law, the name given to those who exercise ordinary jurisdiction in the external form. As ordinary jurisdiction is by law attached to an office, he who has canonical possession of that office can exercise the jurisdiction pertaining to the office. Therefore, besides the Roman pontiff, the name ordinary is applied to those who rule a diocese or a district tantamount to a diocese. Diocesan bishops, their vicars general, prelates, nullius, and their vicars, vicars apostolic, and prefects. Now, I have no idea what that means. And it's very, very interesting. You would need a dictionary to define most of the terms in there and figure out exactly what it means. And that's the way a lot of the church works. A lot of the rules that govern the church, they're almost impenetrable to the average person. So what I did is define ordinary up front in the book a couple of ways. In the first place, it could be an adjective, and I define it as of no special quality or interest, commonplace, unexceptional. And the example I like to use is she was just an ordinary woman. The other way it can be used is as a noun, which most people don't realize, and that means it can be a bishop, an archbishop, or any other priest or his deputy in his capacity as an absolute church authority. And absolute is the word. No questions asked, absolute power. So this book is about how ordinary power, and that's church power, affects ordinary people, people like us, you and I. It spans a period from the late 1960s until 1986 and takes place in various spots in the Catholic world, including Rome and the Vatican, but mostly right here in a fictionalized, more or less, Massachusetts. So I want to just share with you a couple of headlines, see if I can get them in the right order. This is from the Valley Advocate, and it's from April 9th to April 15th, 1992, and it's called Priests in Trouble. And the sub-headline is The Community Struggles with Charges of Child Molestation by Local Priests. This is out in the western part of the state. June 26, 1992, here's a headline from the Globe Metro section. And it's entitled Clergy Answers Charges. Side-by-side stories. One of them is Hingham priests plead guilty to boys' rape. And the other one right next to it is Shelburne Falls priest pleads guilty to assault. And what's really interesting about this is we're going back to 92. So we're going back more than 20 years. And if you look at it, you have one in our section of the state and you have another way out in the western part of the state. And here's one that's a little closer to home. This is the Eagle Tribune, 2002, our own paper. Priests counseled at home and family area. And it describes how priests with sexual problems, including pedophilia, lived for several years in a white ranch house in Georgetown. And nobody in that community knew that they were there or what was going on. And then finally, wrong one. Finally, this one. This is a week ago tomorrow, last Friday before Memorial Day. UN again faults Vatican on abuse. And what's really interesting is every time I stopped trying to do this, I used to say to myself, you know, it's old hat, you know, people aren't going to be interested anymore. Why do I even bother to try to write the book? The Catholic Church has always managed to come through and put it back on the front page in one way or another. It's really extraordinary. This is over 15 years or more. So, it's pretty obvious. What all these pieces tell us is that the sexual abuse crisis, the scandal in the Roman Catholic Church has been around for a while. It's still with us, and it's going to be with us for a while. But how did it happen? And that's what I wanted to write about. So the book is a novel. It's fiction. I travel a lot for work. Last year I needed extra pages for my passport. And whenever I go anywhere, I try to take a good novel, historical novel, or a mystery set in the place that I'm going to, because it helps me really get a better feel for the place. So I like fiction grounded in reality, and that's what I tried to do with this book. So I started doing my research in the late 90s. My daughter Amy, who's at the rear of the room, was in college at the time, and she helped me. Got me lots of clippings. And I asked myself back then, how does a scandal like this happen? This is a long time ago. And what kinds of things, if it was happening then, what kinds of things were going on in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that led to it? So that became the time frame to tell the story, and I decided early on the story would end before a lot of the stuff that are in these articles and a lot of the stuff that everyone's familiar with had occurred. The title, I know, sounds like a horror story, and in a lot of ways it really is a horror story. I shared a very early draft with a writer friend I knew who had written several critically acclaimed books on the Vietnam War, and his comment was he didn't like it, and he said, well, you know, who's the hero? And I thought about it, and I answered after a while, and I said, There are no heroes in this story, and that's the simple fact of it. There are no heroes. But hopefully, I've got a couple of heroines in the story. So the story takes place in a time where there's no internet, no cell phones, no social networks. You could live in Worcester and have no idea what it was like in a fairly good-sized town like Grafton or Hudson, despite the fact that they were in close proximity. I grew up in Framingham, and I'm almost embarrassed to say that I did not have any idea what Lawrence was like until one day in the early 80s. I came looking at Andover to see if we wanted to live here. We were living out in the Midwest at the time, and there was a movie playing, and I saw that it was playing over in Lawrence, so I went over there to see it, and I saw that industrial skyline for the first time, and I was like amazed, and just had never even imagined that it could be there. And like, it's a time when if you were out and really needed to make a phone call, you had to do it from a phone booth, which one of the characters who's quite desperate at the time does do in this book. So in many ways, Ordinary Evil takes place in a world that no longer exists, but I'm sure that it's a world that some of you are familiar with. The central characters are 3 priests and 2 Catholic women, who both happen to be devoted mothers. In addition, swirling them around them is an assorted cast of bishops, archbishops, priests, husbands, detectives, cops, judges, and my personal favorite, lawyers, and even a potential saint or two. And of course, the children and the young people who we all too often nowadays refer to as, quote unquote, the victims. All these characters each inhabit their own little worlds, but as the book progresses, their worlds begin to intersect, and eventually they collide with devastating consequences. There is a rather high body count to the book, and for anyone that might think that it's not realistic, you just have to see the clippings. I know that there's one clipping that I couldn't find that talks about, of all places, Wichita, Kansas, and the death of 4 boys due to suicide and different things, and it's just devastating. Now, one could describe the plot the way 2 of the characters described it. One of them's a priest who also happens to be a psychiatrist, which is a fascinating combination to say the least, because he treats priests with sexual problems at the particular time of the story. He's aware of what's going on very early on, and he likens it to a puzzle. As a psychiatrist, he says, I try not to judge, but somebody has to do something. I'm not the only one working on this puzzle. No one individual can conceive of what the ultimate image will look like from the few pieces that they have. But someday all of this will come out, and the picture will not be very pretty. Another character is a retired detective, haunted by the murder of the altar boy mentioned on the book's cover. Still obsessed with the case, he's talking to the mother of the murdered boy many years after the killing, telling her things about the crime that he knows that she does not. And he says, in most homicides, no one ever has all the answers. People get bits and pieces, but nobody knows it all. Only God sees the whole truth, and he's not talking. I just thought you had a right to know what I know. So what I was trying to do in the book is to show that no one's got all the pieces. That's one of the reasons that the situation could occur. Fester for so long, and then only erupt decades later. But I wanted to give the reader some idea of what the pieces were so they could see what basically, and this may sound a little pretentious, but I wanted kind of a God's eye view. Nobody knew, even some of the bishops, who were in it up to their ears, didn't know that it was as widespread as it was at this particular time. So the effort was to try to do the God's eye view, so to speak. And it's interesting because a lot of people, they do a first book, and if you looked at 90% of them, they'd be written in the first person. And the other thing is they're usually about writing. So fortunately, managed to not do that, so I was very happy. So I'm going to try to read a couple of sections of the book. The first occurs very early, June 1967. One of the main characters is an Italian priest named Luchino Montefiore. He's been groomed to become a Vatican diplomat. And in many ways, he's the conscience of the book. Though young, he's already witnessed a lot of things that really gnaw at him. He wants to speak up, but he doesn't quite know how. And as I'm sure all of us realize too well, being pricked by your conscience doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to act and take action. So in this section, he's attending a celebratory mass at the Vatican. Let's see if I can find it. If God is truly listening, how does he distinguish among the prayers of so many millions? Has he criteria to answer prayers? Or do his responses depend on his mood? Tonight especially, Father Lucchino Montefiore was thinking that from his high balcony perch. Is this what prayer sounds like? It was a timely question given the spectacular quest for God's attention taking place below him. Magnificent music permeated St. Peter's Basilica, reverberating high above the exquisitely twisted columns of the baldacchino over the sacred altar, and rumbling downward, deep beneath it, perhaps to the very tomb of St. Peter himself. Thousands had gathered before a great stage erected to the level of the altar. On it, a massive orchestra and choir were performing Beethoven's Missa Solemnis. The sheer majesty of the Gloria seemed to accelerate skyward, with sufficient force to breach Michelangelo's cupola far above, shattering it into 1,000,000 pieces in a frantic attempt to touch the object of its passion. Though the very walls trembled, Father Montefiore was wondering just how many prayers would simply drown in this music's mighty wake. The performance had been personally commissioned by His Holiness to commemorate the 50th anniversary of his ordination. A lover of German music and the fine arts, this Pope, the former Archbishop of Milan, had made his prior residence a salon for some of the world's most talented artists and musicians. There, Montefiore, through the patronage of his mentor, Valerio della Rovere, Archbishop of Urbino, had received the highly sought privilege of attending private performances. And because he showed impressive promise and had expressed interest in a diplomatic career, more privileges would likely follow him. At the moment, however, none of that mattered, because one aspect of the spectacle greatly troubled him. Before the great stage, front row center, sat the Pope, who in the wake of the great reforms promised by Vatican II had stood fast on the issues of sex and procreation, issues which were causing many priests to leave the church. Surrounding His Holiness, seated on the floor at his feet, were hundreds of newly ordained priests, Europeans, Americans, Latin Americans, Asians, Africans, Indians. This new generation in the presence of the Pope should have been an unequivocal image of hope for the Church and the world. That and the music should have traced all apprehension from Montefiore's mind. Instead, it was impossible for him not to consider his own experiences. Upon his arrival, he thought he had glimpsed the gaunt Monsignor from the episode in the Berlin Cathedral. Could that spectral figure, who had continued to tweak his conscience, actually be in such close proximity to the Holy Father, in a place in which proximity meant everything? Although he could barely discern the features of those below, he continued to scan the faces anyway, asking himself what sort of men are these. The only answer came in the rumble of timpani, followed immediately by the anguished voices of the chorus with their fervent prayer, "Give us peace." As for his concerns, perhaps he'd been wrong about all of this. It was certainly possible. If only he could talk about it with someone he trusted. Only where would he ever begin? "Forgive me," he whispered, hoping God could hear him above the chorus. So that's one of the early scenes with Lucchino Montefiore, who is, like I say, the conscience of the place, the conscience of the book. The second piece that I'd like to read to you takes place a decade later, 10 years after the murder mentioned on the cover of the book. And it's no secret that a murder occurs. All you have to do is look at the cover and you realize that somebody gets killed. This piece centers on Veronica Hearn, who's the murdered boy's mother, whom I nicknamed Ronnie. The spectacle that Lucchino Montefiore just witnesses in the piece I just read reflects one end of the spectrum of the story, the higher end, the ordinary, the power, the all-powerful church. But Ronnie represents the other end. She's simply the ordinary Catholic woman and mother. And in this scene, she's attending her own mother's funeral. Ronnie Hearn's tired eyes followed the pallbearers, whose hands rested on the gleaming surface of her mother's coffin as they wheeled it down the center aisle to the altar. Her husband and daughters, all garbed in black, were seated beside her, but to Ronnie they may as well have been invisible. All she could think about was how everything in life somehow comes down to this, a box whose contents will dwindle to dust. At the conclusion of the Mass, the altar boy, whom she could hardly bear to look at, assisted the priest in preparing the censer. As he held out his chain to the priest, a thin plume of smoke from the burning incense inside the container became visible. The priest, securing the chain in both hands, walked around the coffin, gently swinging the censer in a gesture of purification, bathing the casket in scented smoke. All Ronnie could think about was how badly she needed a cigarette. She was finally able to light up on the way to the cemetery. The procession, the hearse laden with coffin and flowers, followed by the Hearns in a black limousine, passed slowly by the alabaster statue of the Madonna at the cemetery gate. It passed the graves of the sisters and proceeded up the gentle sloping hill to the plot, where 2 generations of Ronnie's family, Reardons and Hearns, were buried. While she stood over the draped open hole that awaited her mother's coffin, Ronnie surveyed the grounds. Lush and green in the warmth of spring, the trees and grass seemed so alive around the spot where she had stood 10 years earlier to bury her son. The circumstances could not have been more different. Her mother had finally succumbed to the ravages of dementia. That God had allowed her to live so long, beyond her capacity to understand anything other than immediate sensation, struck Ronnie as exceedingly cruel. Yet even before that, she had no doubt that God could be pitiless. In her angry sorrow, she had drifted away from the Roman Catholic Church, only to realize it was not a lover easily spurned. In spite of her bitterness, she could not drift very far. She might skip Mass for weeks at a time, but before long, Christmas would arrive. On Christmas Eve, attending midnight Mass together was important to the rest of her family. She would stay again for weeks. Before though long, it would be Ash Wednesday, and with it Lent. She couldn't easily ignore her family's entreaties not to skip Mass on Palm Sunday, nor visit the church to commemorate Jesus' agony in the garden on Holy Thursday, his crucifixion on Good Friday, or his resurrection on Easter Sunday. Foregoing confession, or reconciliation as Catholics now referred to it, was much easier for her. Ronnie was not about to share her sins and her anger with anyone, especially some priest. Because she no longer confessed her sins, she had abstained from Holy Communion. If she did go to Mass, she remained behind alone. Her husband and daughters, who did receive the host, knew well enough to avoid her eyes on the way back to the pew. She had refrained from attending church weddings, preferring instead to appear at receptions. Funerals, however, especially this one, left her no choice but to return. While the burial prayers were read, her eyes fixed on the carved entry on her family's tombstone. Kevin Francis Hearn, born March 4, 1957, returned to God May 11, 1970. She thought about the plot. What made it special was the large maple tree that shaded the hillside where it lay. It held spaces for 8, couples ideally, husbands and wives, and their children's husbands and wives. Kevin's death had altered that. The chain of generations in her family had been broken, another reason for her to smolder in silence. She was in no mood for priests either. They no longer had faces of their own. To Ronnie, they all looked like Father Daskin, the priest who had abandoned her after Kevin's death. An amen from the mourners interrupted her thoughts. The rite was complete. They were now free to disperse. Father Malone, the young priest who had presided, took a deep breath, timidly approached Ronnie, and extended his hand. "We haven't had a chance to meet yet, to get to know each other, Mrs. Hearn. I'm so sorry for your loss. I visited your mother many times." With no enthusiasm, she accepted his hand. "So did I," she said. He hesitated a moment. "I'm also aware of what happened to your son. I want you to know that I pray for you." Tim Hearn, who stood beside his wife with his arm protectively around her waist, watched her study the priest. "Given what you suffered," Father Malone said, "it must be hard to be a person of faith. But if you pray for God's grace, you'll be able to accept this and go on. Please don't let what's happened to you turn you away from God." Tim gave Ronnie a slight tug in the hope that she would respond favorably. She was tempted to walk away right then, but the faces of her husband and daughters silently pleaded with her to say something. "I haven't, Father," she said. Her eyes, however, were dark and cold. "And I won't." "Take this then." Malone handed her a card. "Perhaps you'll see fit to use it." Ronnie accepted it. A glance revealed the phrase, "grief counseling," in embossed capital letters. Barely suppressing a desire to shove it in his face, her eyes found Tim's. They begged her to accept the card. She did. "Thank you, Father," she said. "When you're ready, Mrs. Hearn," the priest said, "it will help bring you peace." Ronnie, the card clutched in her hands, watched the priest walk away. She was about to toss it into her mother's open grave when Tim grabbed her hand. "No, Ronnie, please. He means well." "Fine," she said, her patience exhausted. She shoved the card into her purse and broke away from her family. Although her heels kept getting stuck in the soft ground, she did not slow down on her way to the limousine. She was about to get inside when something made her stop. She looked up at the sky, which had begun to cloud over. Then she saw the old man. Dressed in grungy work clothes and a baseball cap, he was standing on the next hill, watching her. She could not see his face, but she was certain she had seen him before. On the drive out of the cemetery, Ronnie rolled down her window to get a closer look at him. Seeing him seated at the wheel of a little bobcat made her remember. He had filled in Kevin's grave. A decade later, still alive, again he was helping her bury her dead. So that's a piece that describes Ronnie Hearn, and these two scenes kind of, I'm getting back to that spectrum where I talked about the two definitions of ordinary. One is the absolute church power that the priests have. The other is the ordinary people, people like us. And Ronnie represents people like us. She's simply an ordinary Catholic woman and mother. And yet she has been the victim of a terrible tragedy. She's lost a son. And in a lot of ways, she doesn't even know how much she's been victimized. And many of the characters, like I say, they don't know everything. And so it's only by reading the whole book that they all start to come together. But even at the end, a lot of them don't necessarily know everything. The reader knows. So that was the whole idea. And these two sections are about as different as they can be, but they do represent the two sides of the conflict. And so what I'd like to do now is like to answer any questions. If any of you have any specific questions about the book, I haven't told you too much. I haven't given some of the graphics stuff. I haven't read some of the graphic stuff. I find it very difficult to read it. I've tried a couple of things, and it's just very hard to read. So I tried to pick something. Yes.
The first section that you read, where Montefiore is
At the Mass,
at
yeah.
the Mass, he makes a reference to something he'd observed in Berlin, and he was conflicted over whether he should speak about that.
He is delivering a diplomatic pouch to a bishop, and the bishop's secretary is a Monsignor, and the Monsignor, the bishop recommends that he go to a concert that evening. He goes to that concert, and he sees the Monsignor involved in a very questionable interaction with a father and his son. I wouldn't tell you any more than that. And so elsewhere throughout the book, there are other things alluded to that he has seen in the course of growing up. And so he is definitely guilt-ridden, and he wants to be able to talk to somebody about it. And he does eventually talk to somebody about it relatively early in the book, but I wouldn't want to read that, because that's, again, one of my favorite scenes, but I don't like to give it away because I think it makes a couple of really good points. But he's seen things, and it's really interesting. If you hang around any place and you keep your eyes open, it's amazing what you will see. You know, and what I think is really interesting too is that you see things. I don't know about all of you, but I remember when I was like 14, 15, you know, I'd see something. I'm not necessarily talking about stuff like this. And I wouldn't realize the meaning of it. I wouldn't realize the implications of it. And then like 20 years later, whatever, you know, all of a sudden, you know, the light goes on, and it's like, oh, that's what was going on. And not necessarily a bad thing. It could be a good thing. You know, it's just in how your intuition works and your life experience. So that's what that was about. It's interesting too that the Missa Solemnis really happened. That's a real event. There actually were two choirs on the stage, and those priests were really And what that did for me was it gave me an opportunity to take something real and have somebody reflect on it, but in a totally different way than what it was intended for, because it was intended to celebrate the Pope's birthday. And I did something completely different with it. So, can I answer any other questions? Any questions about either the book, the process, the subject? Yes.
It was so complex with all those characters. How did you map it all out and figure it out?
I knew how it was going to end before I started it. And then I had X number of characters, and I knew I had the 3 priests. And then somewhere along the way, I decided that what I was going to, I tried to almost look at it, not mathematically, but I decided that each chapter was going to have X number of people, and that I was going to try to keep it short. There's probably another 100 pages of the book that aren't in it. That came out at different points on the line. But after a while, I started to really look at it, viciously, and try to not spend too long here, go there. And it's interesting. It's not easy to do. Most people will tell you that what you should do is you should outline it all. Everybody, any editor will say, outline it, and then get yourself a nice outline, and then, but I just find it impossible to do. So I tried to impose some structural things on it. But it's a technique
So often different places too.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of the chapter heading is a place.
Right. It's a place or a year, and the thing was, at one point I thought about, and I abandoned it very quickly because I couldn't make it work. I was going to try to have a map of the fictional Massachusetts. But then I knew as soon as I put the Quabbin Reservoir out there, I was in big trouble. But it's interesting. I mean, the whole the stuff about the reservoir is. I just had to go to Memorial Day, and I went to put the flowers on my parents' grave. My whole family's is in one place, and there's a thing I talk about in the book that I really like it. It's like you'd have to see it. Have any of you seen the aqueducts that go through, the bulges in the ground in this part of the state? If you lived in Framingham, it's amazing. You see these big, they're like little hills that, but they're like 15 feet high in some places, and they're all coming all the way from the Quabbin Reservoir out to Boston to bring the water here. And the interesting thing was that it reminded me a lot of the church because, it was all connected. It was all connected. And every town had a parish, and what the bishops could do is they could take somebody who transgressed in one town, and they could move them 40 miles away, and you just didn't know. I mean, you just wouldn't know. The capacity to know what was going on just wasn't there for the people that were in the parishes. So, yes?
So you mentioned that you did a lot of research and you showed us all the clippings from different newspapers and, all those it makes you wonder how much more is out there. But did you actually use the real, stories, real scenarios in your book, making up the names, or did you come up with your own scenarios?
Some of them are a complete fabrication. Father Lucchino Montefiore is a complete fabrication. The crucifixions that he witnesses, though, are very, very real. They still do them. They were doing them last week. Father Ren McFarland is based on a real person. Father Dascom, who's the villain of the piece, I guess you would say, is a compendium of a couple of different cases. In that, I study the cases. It's really interesting. After 9/11, Amy and I, my daughter and I, we went to a funeral mass for my aunt's only grandson. He was killed on one of the planes. And we're sitting there in the pew. My mother was with us, and it was really interesting. The priest said something like this. He said, even if he could come back, he wouldn't want to because he's with God now. And we both looked at each other at that minute. We were sitting in the pew. We both looked at each other and we went, huh? And so that was a real thing that I witnessed that I used in the book. And the two women are fictional creations. You know, I mean, they're very, very different. And I'm trying to think. Some of the other characters are based, you know, there's, you know, I based it on somebody that I'd read about. And then what I would do too is I would try to find out more about those people. I have a bibliography that's like about 5-6 pages long. And for instance, you might read an account and see one little paragraph and it would tweak your interest. So then I would look for other places and see if I could find out something else about it. I'd get 3 newspapers and read the same story. And it always amazed me that there'd be some detail that somebody didn't cover that to me was fascinating. You know, and that's, you know, so it's a combination of the two. But you know, it's really, there were many times when I would have put it in the drawer and forgotten about it. And there was one time when I thought, that's it, it's gone. And I literally had this feeling, it's the strangest feeling. I thought that Ronnie Hearn was busy off in her house doing whatever she was doing, and Kate Grogan was off in her life doing whatever she was doing, and all of this stuff. You know, and I was at peace with it. And then things just happened that I decided to take it out of the drawer again. You know, there was just like, things happen. And you say, you know, I got to take it out of the drawer and at least throw it out there so somebody can read it, you know. But it's really the South American stuff that's in there. One of those is Roseanne, who's sitting here in the front row. Roseanne worked for years for an organization called Por Cristo, which was under the direct control of Cardinal Law. And thanks to Roseanne, my wife and I got to go to Cardinal Law's at dinner and have dinner with the Cardinal, which was a, you know, it's very interesting. And the description of that, what's going on in that scene's based on stuff that we actually saw in Latin America. She lived there for years and years and years. And so, you know, I had, you know, as a Catholic, I'd grown up Catholic. I was never educated Catholic, but it was a good way to grow up. And I never saw any of this stuff when I was growing up. I know other people who never saw any of this stuff, never had a clue. But it was a good way to grow up, but it got perverted. And the way it got perverted was because there's a term that's not in the book. And a friend of mine who used to be a priest, who's a wonderful man, he told me this term. It's called scandalum pucellorum, right? Paul? Scandalum pucellorum, which is scandal of the little ones or scandal of the little boys. And scandal, if you read about scandal in the church, scandal whatever it is, whether it's somebody stealing money, whether it's somebody getting, you know, fathering a child or whatever. Scandal is to be prevented at all costs, because one of the worst things that can happen to the church is a scandal, because it would tempt us, poor stupid us, to turn away from the church. So you have to prevent the scandal. And it's interesting because my daughter continually brought up when we were, you know, when we were talking, she would mention in the last couple of years the Penn State thing, because that's the closest thing, I think. It's a much more closed kind of scandal, but it's a really interesting example. It just doesn't involve the whole world and a bunch of countries, but it does involve one small sphere. So, you know, that's. I will say one other interesting thing, and I wasn't going to read that second piece. And I was going to read another piece that I like very, very much. And then I picked up the Globe yesterday morning, and there's a great article on the cover about Joseph Finder, whose book's right over there. It's called Suspicion. Mm-hmm. I've read most of his books. He's trying to do something different with this. His books are page-turners. He's really good. And he said that he bought out his contract, and he bought out his contract for 7 figures. He borrowed that much money to buy out his contract because he wanted to write a different type of book. And one of the things that he says in there is that according to his own market research, and I'm quoting him now, female readers represent about 70% of the book-buying public interested in fiction of any kind. So I thought, well, you know, I mean, if it was worth that much to him, maybe I ought to think about it. So, you know, and I'm just going to close by saying, and if there's any other questions, I'll be happy to answer them. But, you know, there's so many good books, and, you know, you just have to go out and read them. You know, that's a great, Suspicion's probably pretty good. Andre Dubus's Townie is about growing up in Haverhill. Haverhill is one of the best books about families, and an incredible meditation on violence. Just incredible good book. You'll never look at Haverhill the same way again. Terrific book. And then there's another wonderful book called The Art of Fielding by Chad Harbark, which is about, it's not about baseball. It is a little bit about baseball, but it's about something much, much deeper than that. Just a wonderful book, one of the best I've read in years. And you can get those books, but the only way you get them is you've got to read these brochures that they put out, what's new and recommended, and you've got to just try to keep reading, and then you've got to come to places like this. So I thank you all for coming, all my friends and family. Appreciate the privilege. Thank you.